There's a particular silence that falls over a room when someone says something that doesn't fit. Not an argument, not a refusal, just a quiet, certain statement that lands wrong, too calm, too final, too sure, and leaves everyone else waiting for the part that explains it. That silence fell over the conference room at Dalton County Farm Supply on a Thursday morning in March of 2019, when a 31-year-old named Marcus Holt looked across a table covered in order forms and lease agreements and a John Deere sales representative's leather portfolio, and said 4 words. "We're canceling the order." The order was for 14 new John Deere units, tractors, a combine, a planter, a sprayer, $812,000 of the most advanced agricultural equipment on the market. Equipment his father had spent the better part of 2 years selecting. Equipment the sales rep had been cultivating since the previous spring. Equipment that the county's farmers had been watching the Holt operation prepare to buy, the way farmers watch everything their most successful neighbor does, with a combination of respect and careful attention. And Marcus Holt, 2 years out of agricultural college, 18 months into running the family operation, had just canceled every unit of it. The sales rep asked why. Marcus said he'd be happy to explain, and then he laid out, quietly and methodically and without any drama, the reason that nobody in that room had anticipated and that nobody in Dalton County would understand for another 2 years. This is the story of what Marcus Holt knew, how he knew it, and what happened when the county finally caught up. If you're new here, this channel tells the stories that happen in real farm country, not the headlines, not the statistics, the decisions, the moments, the men and women who saw something coming before everyone else and acted on it even when nobody believed them. Subscribe if that's what you want more of, and let's get into the Holt family story. To understand why Marcus canceled that order, you first have to understand what he was canceling it from. The Holt operation, Holt Family Farms, had been running in Dalton County, Illinois since 1961, started by Marcus's grandfather, Earl Holt, on 320 acres of black Illinois ground that Earl had bought from a retiring neighbor for what everyone at the time said was more than the land was worth. It wasn't more than it was worth. Earl just understood something about that particular piece of ground that the people laughing at his purchase price didn't. By the time Marcus's father, Dennis Holt, took over the operation in 1989, it had grown to 1,400 acres. Corn and soybeans, the standard Illinois rotation, executed with the kind of precision that comes from 3 decades of learning a specific set of fields in a specific county with specific soil profiles and specific drainage patterns. Dennis was not a flashy farmer. He was a careful one. The difference matters more than most people realize. Dennis had run the operation on John Deere equipment his entire career, not out of brand loyalty in any sentimental sense, but out of practical experience. The local dealership, Larkin Farm Equipment, had been a reliable partner. Parts availability was good. Service response was adequate. The equipment performed well on the Holt ground. When something broke during planting or harvest, the dealer got a tech out fast, enough to matter. That kind of relationship, built over 30 years of transactions and handshakes and occasional late-night phone calls during equipment emergencies, has real value. Dennis understood that. By 2017, when Dennis was 61 and starting to think seriously about transition, the Holt fleet was aging. The oldest combine was 12 years old. 3 of the row crop tractors were pushing 10. The planter was 9. Not ancient, these are machines built for a long working life, but approaching the point where the calculation between maintaining aging equipment and investing in new starts to shift. Dennis had been thinking about a full fleet renewal for 2 years. He'd had conversations with the dealer. He'd been to the regional John Deere demo day twice. He knew what he wanted: 4 new row crop tractors, a new combine, a new planter, a self-propelled sprayer, and several smaller pieces. He'd done the math on the financing. The numbers worked. Barely, the way farm numbers always barely work, but they worked. And then in the spring of 2017, Dennis Holt had a heart attack. It wasn't fatal. Dennis was in the field, checking the planter calibration on a Tuesday afternoon when he felt the pressure in his chest that he'd been telling himself for 6 months was just stress. He drove himself to the emergency room in town, which his cardiologist later told him was either very lucky or very stupid and was probably both. He spent 5 days in the hospital and came home with a prescription, a diet plan, and a clear message from his doctor. The 6-day weeks and the harvest season 18-hour days were done, which meant the transition he'd been thinking about for 2 years had to happen now, not eventually. Marcus Holt had been working alongside his father full-time since graduating from the University of Illinois with a degree in agricultural systems management in 2015. He was 27 years old when his father's health changed the timeline. He'd grown up on this land, knew every field, understood the operation as well as anyone. But taking over management of a 1,400-acre corn and soybean operation with an aging fleet and a significant equipment renewal pending is not a small responsibility, regardless of how well you were prepared for it. Marcus accepted the responsibility without a lot of ceremony. That was his personality, quiet, methodical, the kind of person who processes information carefully before acting on it. His father had always said Marcus thought too much before he moved. Marcus had always suspected his father didn't think quite enough. The equipment renewal was the first major decision Marcus had to make as the operational head of Holt Family Farms. And instead of picking up where his father had left off, 14 units, $812,000, John Deere, done, Marcus said he wanted to take 6 months before signing anything. Dennis, recovering at home, said that was probably excessive. Marcus said he wanted to be sure. Dennis said sure about what? It's John Deere. We've been buying John Deere for 30 years. Marcus said that was exactly what he wanted to think about. Dennis looked at his son for a long moment and then said, "All right, take your 6 months." His tone suggested he thought this was excessive caution from a young man who hadn't yet learned that overthinking costs you as much as underthinking. He was wrong about that. But he wouldn't know he was wrong for another 2.5 years. The 6 months Marcus had asked for turned into 12, and then into 18, and the John Deere sales rep, a patient man named Kevin Garrity, who had been working the Holt account since 2015, made regular visits and received regular assurances that the decision was coming. He had no reason to doubt it. The Holts were a serious operation. The fleet was genuinely aging. The financing was in place. Every signal pointed toward a closing. What Kevin Garrity didn't know was what Marcus had been doing with those 18 months. It started with a conversation. In the fall of 2017, 3 months after taking over the operation, Marcus drove to the University of Illinois Extension office in the county seat to talk to an agricultural economist named Dr. Susan Fenn, who had spent the previous 4 years studying equipment ownership costs on large-scale Midwestern grain farms. Marcus had read one of her papers in college and remembered it. He made an appointment. Dr. Fenn's research had been focused on a question that most equipment buyers don't ask at the moment of purchase. What is the total cost of ownership over a 10-year operating horizon, including not just purchase price and standard maintenance, but service costs, downtime costs, and the cost implications of the equipment's software architecture? That last item, software architecture, was where Dr. Fenn's research had taken an unexpected turn. She walked Marcus through what her data showed. John Deere's newest equipment generation, the generation Marcus was being asked to purchase, operated on a closed software platform. The diagnostic systems, the fault codes, the electronic controls, all of it accessible only through John Deere's proprietary diagnostic tools, available exclusively to authorized dealers. Independent mechanics, the men and women who had kept farm equipment running in rural counties for generations, charging $60 to $90 an hour because they had real competition, could not access the diagnostic systems on these machines, not because they lacked the skill, because the software wouldn't let them in. The authorized dealer rate in Dalton County was $165 an hour. Marcus asked what happened to that rate when independent mechanics were locked out entirely. Dr. Fenn said her modeling suggested the rate would reach $220 to $260 an hour within 3 to 5 years of the software lock taking full effect. Marcus asked when the software lock would take full effect on the current equipment generation. Dr. Fenn said it was already partially in effect and would be fully implemented by 2021 or 2022. Marcus sat in that office and did math in his head. 14 units. A 1,400-acre operation running equipment an average of 12 hours a day during the critical planting and harvest seasons. Authorized service at $250 an hour, with no competitive alternative. He didn't need a spreadsheet to understand what the number was going to look like. He drove home and built the spreadsheet anyway. Over the following 3 months, Marcus gathered 3 additional lines of evidence, approaching it the way he'd been taught to approach complex decisions in college, not relying on a single source, however credible, but looking for convergence across independent inputs. The first was the mechanics. Marcus drove to 6 independent equipment shops across 3 counties and sat down with the owners, not to get quotes or to discuss specific. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. Repairs. To ask what they were seeing. What they told him, each independently, was consistent enough to qualify as a pattern. Diagnostic access on new John Deere equipment was narrowing year by year. Fault codes that had been accessible through third-party tools 18 months ago were no longer accessible. They could still do oil changes and physical maintenance. The electronic systems were increasingly off-limits. One mechanic, a 58-year-old named Dale Fortner, who'd been working on farm equipment in Dalton County since 1982, put it directly, "Marcus, in 4 years I won't be able to touch a new John Deere. Not because I don't know how, because the computer won't let me. And your dealer knows that as well as I do. You can guess what that does to the price they charge once I'm out of the picture." The second line was the right to repair movement. Marcus had been following it peripherally during college and started tracking it closely in 2018. What the legislative history showed was that John Deere had been one of the most active opponents of right-to-repair legislation in multiple states, not secretly, openly, with lobbying resources and public statements. A company doesn't spend those resources fighting legislation unless the legislation threatens something valuable. What it threatened was the service monopoly that the closed software architecture created. The lobbying itself was evidence. The third line was the most direct. Marcus called 8 other farm operations across Illinois and Indiana, operations of similar scale to the Holt's, all running late-model John Deere equipment, and asked a simple question. What are you paying for authorized service, and what were you paying 3 years ago? The answers varied in their specifics. They did not vary in their direction. Every single operation had seen service costs increase. The average increase across the 8 operations over 3 years was 61%. One operation had seen 104%. Marcus went home after that last call and sat at his father's kitchen table, now, and looked at the spreadsheet he'd been building for 6 months. The numbers were not ambiguous. Over a 10-year ownership horizon on 14 new units at current and projected authorized service rates, the Holt operation would pay approximately $1,200,000 more in service costs than the purchase price of the fleet had implied. That number was not a worst-case projection. It was the middle of the range. He called his father. Dennis listened to everything. The economist, the mechanics, the right-to-repair lobbying, the 8 operations he'd called. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Son, if what you're telling me is right, why isn't everybody talking about this?" Marcus said, "Because the people who would feel it most haven't bought the new generation yet, and the people who already bought it haven't owned it long enough to see the full picture." Dennis was quiet again. Then, "What do you want to do?" Marcus said, "I want to cancel the order, refurbish what we have, buy time, let this play out where everyone can see it before we commit." Dennis said, "That is going to cause problems with Kevin Garrity." Marcus said, "I know. Dennis said, "It's going to cause problems in this county. People are going to talk." Marcus said, "I know that too." Dennis was quiet for a third time, a long one. Then he said, "All right, it's your operation now. Make the call you think is right." The meeting with Kevin Garrity was on a Thursday morning in March of 2019. Kevin arrived with his leather portfolio and 14 signed order confirmations and 18 months of careful relationship management and the absolute confidence of a man who has done everything right. Marcus canceled every unit. Kevin asked why. Marcus explained, quietly and completely, what he had found. Kevin said he understood Marcus's concerns, but that the service cost projections were speculative. Marcus said they were modeled on current data from 8 comparable operations, and the trajectory was not speculative, it was arithmetic. Kevin said John Deere was committed to supporting its customers. Marcus said he had no doubt about that, and the question was what supporting customers would cost when the competition that kept the price honest was gone. Kevin packed his portfolio and shook Marcus's hand and said he hoped Marcus would reconsider. Marcus said he appreciated the relationship and he wouldn't. Cunnifern drove back to the dealership and told his manager what had happened. His manager called the regional rep. The regional rep noted it in the system as a lost sale, pending reconsideration, and moved on to the next account. In Dalton County, the conversation started almost immediately. Word travels in farm country the way it has always traveled, through the elevator, through the co-op, through the Farm Bureau meetings, through conversations at the diner on Main Street on Tuesday mornings when the same 6 men have been having the same conversations in the same booth for 15 years. By the end of March 2019, every serious farmer in Dalton County knew that Marcus Holt had canceled $800,000 in John Deere orders. By the middle of April, most of them had formed an opinion about it. The opinions divided along a line that was partly generational and partly temperamental. The older farmers, the ones who had been buying John Deere for 30 years the way Dennis Holt had, out of practical experience with a reliable relationship, tended toward skepticism, not hostility, just the measured doubt of people who have seen young men with new ideas overestimate their own insight before. Tom Briggs, who farmed 1,800 acres on the east side of the county and was the most respected voice at the Farm Bureau meetings, said it plainly over coffee one morning. Marcus Holt is a smart kid, smart enough to second-guess decisions that have worked for 30 years. That's not always a virtue. The younger farmers were more divided. Some of them had been following the right to repair debate and recognized what Marcus was responding to. A few had already started asking questions about service costs that their fathers had never thought to ask. But even among those who understood the concern, most were skeptical that the numbers were as bad as Marcus was projecting. Phil Newman, 34 years old, 1,200 acres of corn and soybeans on the west side of the county, had bought a new John Deere combine the previous fall. He was at the diner the Tuesday after the news broke and said what a lot of people were thinking. "I just signed a $380,000 note on that machine. If Marcus is right, I want to know. But I don't think he's right. I think he's a 29-year-old who built a scary spreadsheet and panicked." Marcus heard all of it. Small county. He heard the specific things people said and the general shape of what they thought. He didn't respond publicly. He didn't call anyone to explain himself. He went back to the operation, put the $800,000 back in the line of credit, and started the refurbishment program he'd been planning as the alternative. The refurbishment was not glamorous. It was a 12-month program of engine work, hydraulic rebuilds, new wear items, and software updates on the systems that still accepted third-party service. Marcus hired Dale Fortner, the mechanic who had told him about the narrowing diagnostic access, on a contract basis. Dale knew the older machines intimately. What he didn't know about a Holt tractor after 30 years of working on them in this county wasn't worth knowing. The total cost of the first year's refurbishment program was $112,000, compared to $812,000 for a new fleet, plus projected service cost increases. Marcus's spreadsheet said the refurbishment path was cheaper, even accounting for the downtime risk of older equipment. He believed the spreadsheet. He had to, because the county's opinion of what he'd done wasn't improving. In the fall of 2019, Phil Newman's new combine threw a hydraulic fault code during harvest. The code was in the closed system, not accessible to Dale Fortner or any independent mechanic in the county. Phil called the dealer. The authorized technician arrived the next morning, diagnosed a sensor issue in 45 minutes, billed $210 in labor. Phil paid it, got back to harvest, and told people at the elevator that it wasn't that bad. Marcus heard about it and said nothing. In the spring of 2020, Tom Briggs had his row crop tractor throw a CAN bus communication error during planting. Same situation, closed system, dealer call, authorized tech, 3-hour wait, 1-hour repair, billed at $235. Tom paid it and absorbed the planting delay and told people it was a one-time thing. Marcus still said nothing. In the fall of 2020, 3 things happened within 6 weeks of each other that changed the tone of the conversation in Dalton County. Phil Newman's combine threw a different fault code during harvest. This time, the diagnosis took 4 hours and identified a controller module failure. The module had to be ordered, 2-day wait during peak harvest. The repair, when the tech came back, took 3 hours. The bill was $1,400 in parts and labor. Phil had missed 2 days of harvest weather. Tom Briggs had a software update pushed to his tractor by the dealer's remote management system that introduced a throttle response bug. The update was supposed to improve fuel efficiency. Instead, it created intermittent power losses that made the tractor unusable for field work, until a second update was pushed 4 days later to fix the first one. Tom's authorized service bill for the follow-up call to clear the fault codes generated during those 4 days was $380 for a problem caused by the dealer's own software update. And a young farmer named Clete Warford, 26 years old, 1 year into his first operation on his grandfather's land, had his planter's electronic row clutches start failing during corn planting. 6 of the 24 rows went offline over 3 consecutive days. Each failure required an authorized tech call to diagnose and reset. By the time Clay was done planting, he'd had 4 service calls, 2 parts replacements, and a bill totaling $2,200 on a planter he'd owned for 18 months. He'd also planted 200 acres late enough that the yield drag was visible at harvest. The conversations at the elevator changed that fall. Not dramatically, not in the way of a community that had made a collective decision, more in the way of people who had started doing math they hadn't done before, adding up service calls, comparing notes on wait times, asking each other what they'd paid for the last repair and what the one before that had cost. And somewhere in those conversations, someone always mentioned Marcus Holt. And the mention had a different quality than it had the previous spring, less certainty that he'd been wrong, more question about whether he'd been right. I want to pause here and ask you something before we get to 2021. Marcus Holt was 29 years old when he canceled that order. He had 18 months of data, 3 independent lines of evidence, and a spreadsheet that said the math was clear. And for 2 years nobody believed him. Not because he was wrong, because the evidence wasn't visible yet. Have you ever been in that position, where you knew something was coming that nobody else had seen yet? What did you do? Think about that. Because what Marcus did next is the part that tells you who he is. The spring of 2021 was when the math became impossible to ignore. Authorized service rates at Larkin Farm Equipment had moved. Not in one dramatic announcement, in the incremental way that prices move when the competitive pressure holding them down is slowly removed. The diagnostic rate that had been $165 in 2019 was $210 in 2020 and $245 in 2021. The parts markup on proprietary electronic components had increased alongside it. The wait times for authorized technicians during planting and harvest had also extended, because the same dealer was the only option for a growing number of farmers in a growing number of situations, and the demand for their service hours was outpacing their capacity to supply them. Phil Newman sat down in April of 2021 to total his John Deere service costs for the previous 12 months. He'd bought the combine in 2018. In the first year, his service costs had been modest. Warranty coverage handled most of it. In 2020, his out-of-pocket service total was $9,400. In the 12 months ending March 2021, it was $16,200. His fuel costs for the same machine over the same period had gone down, because the precision fuel management system worked as advertised. His service costs had nearly doubled. Tom Briggs did the same calculation across his 3 newest machines. The number he arrived at was not the number he'd expected. He drove to the diner on a Tuesday morning, sat in the usual booth, and said to the usual group, "I think Marcus Holt was right." The table was quiet in the way of people receiving information they have been approaching for a while and have finally arrived at. By June of 2021, Marcus had received 11 phone calls from farmers in the county asking to see his analysis. Not asking for his opinion, asking to see the actual spreadsheet, the actual data, the 3 years of service cost comparisons from the 8 operations he'd called in 2018. He shared everything, no conditions, no lectures, no version of "I told you so." Just the data, organized the way he'd organized it for himself, with the sources documented and the methodology explained. Some of those 11 farmers had been among the most skeptical voices in 2019. Phil Newman called on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "Marcus, I owe you an apology. I said in public that you'd panicked over a spreadsheet. I was wrong." Marcus said, "You weren't wrong to be skeptical. The evidence wasn't visible yet." Phil said, "It's visible now." Marcus said, "What are you going to do about it?" Phil said, "That's actually why I'm calling." What followed from that conversation, and from the 10 others like it, was the thing Marcus had suspected was possible but hadn't been sure was feasible when he'd made the original decision: a collective response. Marcus proposed it at the Dalton County Farm Bureau meeting in July of 2021. Not a boycott, not a protest, not the kind of adversarial positioning that makes everyone defensive. Something simpler and more durable. A service negotiation group. Every farm operation in the county willing to participate. 16. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. Signed on immediately, 22 within a month, pooling their annual service volume as a single negotiating entity and approaching the dealer with a collective ask for transparent pricing, defined rate schedules, and a commitment to service response times during planting and harvest. The dealer's initial response was resistant. Marcus had expected that. He'd also prepared for it, because he'd spent 3 years understanding the economics of the situation well enough to know where the dealer's flexibility actually lived. The 22 operations in the negotiating group represented, between them, approximately $4 million in annual authorized service expenditure at current rates. That number, presented as a single entity with the credibility of a structured collective rather than a collection of individual complaints, was different from any individual farm's leverage. The dealer's regional manager flew in from Indianapolis for the second meeting. The third meeting produced an agreement, not independence from the authorized network. That wasn't on offer and Marcus hadn't asked for it. What the agreement produced was a defined rate schedule for the next 3 years, a guaranteed service response time of 4 hours during planting and harvest, a parts stocking commitment for the most common failure items on current generation equipment, and a 19% reduction from current diagnostic rates for participating operations. 19% on $4 million a year is $760,000 over 3 years. Returned to the farmers of Dalton County not because John Deere had a change of heart, but because Marcus Holt had spent 3 years preparing the ground for exactly that negotiation. Tom Briggs called him after the agreement was signed. "Marcus, I've been farming this county for 31 years. I've never seen a farmer do what you just did." Marcus said, "I just ran the numbers, Tom." Tom said, "Everybody runs numbers. You ran the right ones 3 years before anyone else and then waited while they caught up." Marcus said, "I wasn't sure they would." Tom said, "What would you have done if they hadn't?" Marcus thought about that, kept refurbishing, bought time, eventually switched brands probably, or bought used. There are options when you haven't committed to a platform that controls your service costs. There aren't many options once you have. Tom was quiet. Then, that's the thing, isn't it? The options. You kept them. Marcus said, my grandfather always said the most expensive thing you can do in farming is run out of options. Marcus Holt is 35 years old now. He runs 1,400 acres of Dalton County corn and soybeans with a mixed fleet, some refurbished older equipment, some new equipment from brands whose software architecture remains more open to independent service, a few newer John Deere units purchased with explicit service agreements negotiated through the county collective. His father Dennis is still alive, still driving through the fields in the mornings, still the most important voice in any conversation about the operation's long-term direction. He told Marcus last fall, in the particular way that fathers tell their sons they were right without quite saying those words, you saved us 2 years of decisions we'd be living with for a decade. The John Deere relationship is not over. It was never about the brand. Marcus has said this clearly in every conversation about what happened. The equipment is exceptional. The precision agriculture capabilities, the yield monitoring, the planting accuracy, these are real advantages that produce real results. The concern was never about the machines. It was about what it costs to keep them running when the competitive pressure on service pricing is gone. That concern is still valid. The collective agreement produced a 3-year rate schedule. 3 years is not forever. The underlying architecture, the closed software, the proprietary diagnostics, the authorized-only service requirement is still in place. The question Marcus asked in 2017 hasn't been answered. It's been deferred, at a discount, for 3 years. Marcus knows that. He's already thinking about what comes next. What I want you to take from this story is not that John Deere is the villain and Marcus Holt is the hero. That's too simple and it misses what actually happened. What happened is that a young man took over a family operation, looked at a purchase decision his father had already made, and instead of signing the papers because that was the obvious next step, asked, what am I actually agreeing to here? He asked it 18 months before the purchase. He gathered real evidence from independent sources. He built a model that made the long-term cost visible before the signature made it irreversible. And when the model said something uncomfortable, he acted on it, even when it cost him relationships and comfort and the county's good opinion of his judgment. That's not a story about John Deere. That's a story about how decisions get made. The farmers who signed their orders in 2019 weren't foolish. They were working from the information they had, making reasonable decisions based on 30 years of experience with a reliable partner. The problem wasn't the decision. It was the information, specifically the information that wasn't visible yet, that was moving toward them on a timeline set by a corporate strategy they had no particular reason to track. Marcus tracked it, not because he was smarter, because he had 6 months of unusual freedom, the freedom of a new operator who hadn't yet committed to the previous operator's plan, and he used that freedom to ask a question that nobody else in the county was asking. What am I signing exactly, and what does it mean 10 years from now? The answer changed everything. His grandfather Earl bought land in 1961 that everybody said was priced too high. He understood something about that ground the people laughing at his purchase price didn't. His father Dennis ran a careful, precise operation for 30 years on the strength of knowing his fields better than anyone else in the county. Marcus canceled $800,000 in orders because he understood something about a spreadsheet that the county wasn't ready to see yet. 3 generations, 3 different kinds of knowledge, 1 consistent quality, the willingness to act on what you understand, even when what you understand hasn't become visible to everyone around you yet. The county asked why 2 years later. By then, Marcus already knew what came next. Here's what I want you to think about tonight. The next time you're standing in front of a significant decision, a purchase, a contract, an agreement that locks you into something for years, ask yourself, what am I agreeing to that isn't on the first page? What does this look like in year 7, not year 1? Who holds the leverage in this relationship once I've committed? And is that leverage going where I think it's going? Marcus Holt didn't have special access to secret information. He had a retired economist's paper, 6 mechanics' honest assessments, 8 phone calls to comparable operations, and a spreadsheet that anyone with the same data could have built. What he had that was rare was the willingness to ask the question before he signed, and the patience to wait for the county to arrive at the answer he'd already found. The $800,000 stayed in the line of credit. The fleet got refurbished, the county got organized, and a 31-year-old farmer who everyone said had panicked over a spreadsheet turned out to have done the most useful thing a person can do with information about the future. He acted on it before it became the past. Thank you for being here for this one. If it made you think about a decision you've been about to make, that's exactly what it was supposed to do. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. We put one out every week, and we'll see you in the next one. If this story stayed with you, there are 2 more waiting right now. One is about a mechanic who was fired for refusing one order, and 10 years later owned the dealership that fired him. The other is about the only farmer in his county who read the fine print on his loan, and the Tuesday morning it saved everything he owned. Both are linked in the description. I'll see you there.